In today's video, I'm making a couple of everyday carry knives for some buddies of mine. The steel I'm using is 1084, 1/8 inch thick, and just starting out by tracing my pattern out for my knife, cutting that out on the bandsaw. This little bandsaw I'm using, it's actually a Win portable metal cutting bandsaw, and I built a stand for it. There's a video on my channel. It's worked pretty well. I've cut a lot of pieces out with it, haven't had any issues. And once I had that pattern cut out, took it over to the sander, knocked that burr off the face left over from the bandsaw, and then just did rough profile all the way around, trying to get the basic profile done on the blade. Next step was to grind in the bevels, and I used the little jig that I had made also in a previous video, just using it as a plunge line jig to try and get my bevels nice and even. So I had the profile and the rough grind done. Went ahead and marked the holes for the pins. Took it over to the drill press and drilled the holes out. I went through a couple of normalization steps and then did the hardening. Quenched it in Parks 50 oil. And for the temper on these, I tried something new, something that I had never really done before, and that was to use a torch to temper the tang as well as the blade. And really, I'm just looking at the colors, and I'm bringing the tang up to a purple, a bluish, purplish gray, and trying to keep the blade no darker than just that straw color. So I did that on both of the blades, and then back over to the sander to do a final grinding. And moved over from there to do some hand sanding. I sanded up to 200 grit. I'm going to parkerize and coat these blades with an epoxy, so I didn't really need to go to a much higher grit than that. As far as the scales, I'm using the G10. It's a 2-ply G10 and rubber. I have never used this material before, and the idea behind it was with the rubber, hopefully it'll have a little bit more grip and not be too slippery if the handle ever gets wet. So I'm marking out laying out the handle onto one of the scales, just trying to keep it all clamped together while I drill both the holes. And I put the pins through one scale end, the tang, and then remove one at a time and drill through the second scale. That way I get my holes all lined up. Now I remove the scales and mark which side is which so I don't lose track of the right and the left side. And then I can trace out the tang onto the scale and get that all put back together. So I can cut both scales at the same time, take it over to the bandsaw and cut those out. I leave them pinned together while I do that. That way they're exactly the same shape. They're symmetrical once I get done cutting them out. So I can reassemble it at that point and take the knife back over to the sander and profile those scales. I could have done this at the end after I'd glued the handle together, but because I was parkerizing and coating the blade, then I would have just sanded off my finish along the handle there on the tang. So I tried to do that first. Pull the scales off, ground in the bevel there, right towards the ricasso end of the scale, because you can't really get to that after you glue those on. Then it was time for the parkerizing. I used zinc phosphate parkerizing solution. The real main reason for doing the parkerizing is to create a base for the epoxy coating that I'm going to put on. And spraying that on, the coating I used was Aluma-Hyde epoxy from Brownells. And I sanded some of that off there on the handle, just make sure that I had a good surface for the glue. And you can see I drilled some holes as well in the handle, and I was just trying to get the knife more balanced. It was a little handle heavy, and I needed to take off some weight. So I got that done, and went ahead and put my secondary bevels in on the edge, and it was time to do the glue up. I used G-Flex epoxy. Everything all glued and clamped together, and let it set for, I let it cure for about 24 hours. Used isopropyl alcohol and Q-tips to clean that excess epoxy off before it dried. You come back 30 minutes or an hour later and do that again, because some of it seeps out. So a couple of cleanings to try and keep that epoxy cleaned off. Next step was to grind the pins down flush with the scales, and then just flatten out my scales and put a little bit of a bevel all around the edges. You can see the rubber ply start to show once I'm grinding through that outer layer of the scale. The tannish color is the G10 and the black is the rubber layer. I did some hand sanding on the handle. I used a little bit of WD-40 just to keep the dust down. The G10 creates a lot of dust, and so I just kept it oiled up while I was doing my hand sanding, and just trying to clean those up as best as I could. It was time to get everything nice and sharp. I went through 3 different grits of stone to sharpen these. Sharpen them both by hand that way. And they're both razor sharp and both shave hair. Then it was time to move on to making the sheath. It's going to be a Kydex sheath. So I use painter's tape and put that over the blade and about an inch up the handle, and trim that off with an X-Acto knife. The painter's tape gives you a little bit of extra gap between the knife and the Kydex, so that when you pull the tape off, the Kydex isn't fit too tightly. And I'm marking that out. It's going to be a taco style sheath, and so when I lay it out, I measure about an inch on each side of the knife, and then cut that out. Put that in my little toaster oven, heated it up to about 325 degrees for about a minute. Softens up the Kydex, and I put it in the press, clamp that shut, leave it for 10 or 15 minutes to cool off. I take the knife out and mark out where I'm going to need to put the holes for the rivets and where I'm going to trim the excess off. Just run that over to the bandsaw and trim that excess off, and over to the drill press to drill the holes out for the rivets. Sand those edges up along the Kydex. It's a pretty rough edge after the bandsaw, so try and get those all sanded down. I'm using a little blower there to clean out all the dust and particulate that gets inside the sheath, which that will scratch the blade up. So trying to get all that inside cleaned out before I put the rivets in. I used acetone along the edge as a final step after I had the rivets in. Assembled everything, assembled the clip, take the tape off, and everything's all done. Got a couple of everyday carry knives with Kydex sheath. I want to thank everybody for watching. I hope you liked the video, and we'll see you next time.